The day I found out my husband had been living a double life, I was standing in my kitchen in a bathrobe, holding a letter from a law firm I'd never heard of. It wasn't even addressed to me. It was addressed to my husband Gerald Raymond Whitfield, and it had been opened, then folded back so carefully that I almost missed the crease. Almost. After 31 years of marriage, I knew every habit that man had, including the way he refolded things he didn't want me to see. I was 63 years old. I had spent my entire adult life building something I believed in. I had raised 2 children, buried my mother, survived a breast cancer scare at 57, and through all of it, I had trusted Gerald. Completely. Without question. The way you trust the floor beneath your feet. You don't think about it. You just walk. The letter was from a real estate attorney in Savannah, Georgia. It referenced a property transaction, a condominium purchase, closing set for the following month, in the name of Gerald R. Whitfield and a woman named Vivienne. I stood there in my kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, in my bathrobe, and I read that letter 4 times. Then I set it down on the counter, very gently, next to my coffee cup, and I thought, so that's where the money went. Let me back up. Gerald was a civil engineer. Good one, too. Built a solid career, respected in his field, brought home more than enough for us to live comfortably. We had a house in a good neighborhood, 2 cars, a modest savings account. When our kids were grown and gone, we talked about retiring somewhere warm. We talked about grandchildren. We talked about a river cruise in Europe. We had plans. That's the thing that gets me. Even now. We had so many plans. About 2 years before that morning with the letter, Gerald started behaving differently. Little things at first. His phone was always face down on the table. He started going to the gym, which sounds innocent enough, except Gerald had never voluntarily stepped foot in a gym in 30 years. He started coming home later with explanations that were just slightly too detailed. You know how it is when someone rehearses a lie. It's a little too smooth, a little too complete. I noticed, of course I noticed, but I was 61 years old and I had a full life, and I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that people change in their 60s, that maybe Gerald just needed something for himself. I talked myself out of my own instincts so many times that eventually my instincts just went quiet, went numb. Then 6 months before I found that letter, something unexpected happened to me. My Aunt Frances passed away. Frances was my mother's youngest sister, the one who never married, never had children, and spent 60 years quietly accumulating money while the rest of the family assumed she had none. She drove a 2003 Civic until the day she died. She clipped coupons. She bought her clothes at Goodwill. She was the most financially disciplined person I have ever known, and when she died at 89, she left behind an estate worth just over $1.5 million. She left it all to me. I was her closest living relative on my mother's side, and apparently she had decided somewhere along the way that I was the one she trusted. I didn't know. I had no idea. When the attorney called me, I thought it was a mistake. I made him repeat the number twice. $1,540,000. The first person I wanted to call was Gerald. I was actually reaching for my phone when something stopped me. I still can't explain it fully. Call it 63 years of having survived things. Call it a small, quiet voice in the back of my mind that had been trying to get my attention for months. Whatever it was, I put the phone back down. And I waited. I didn't tell Gerald about Aunt Frances. I told my daughter Beverly, swore her to absolute secrecy, and between the 2 of us we made a plan. The inheritance was processed quietly. The funds went into an account at a credit union in a different county in my name only, opened on a Tuesday afternoon, while Gerald thought I was at my book club. For 6 months I played the role of the woman Gerald thought I was, the woman who didn't notice things, the woman who trusted completely and asked nothing. And all the while, I watched. That's when I found the letter. I stood in my kitchen and I refolded it exactly as Gerald had left it, that careful, barely there crease, and I put it back where I found it, between the water bill and a Costco coupon mailer. Then I poured my coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and I let myself cry for exactly 10 minutes. After that, I was done crying. I want to be honest about what those 10 minutes felt like. It wasn't just grief. It was something more specific and more terrible. It was the feeling of having been made into a fool. 31 years. I cooked for that man, worried over that man, sat with him in emergency rooms, held his hand through his father's funeral, gave up a job offer in Phoenix in 2001 because he didn't want to relocate. 31 years of that, and he was out there buying a condominium in Savannah with a woman named Vivienne. But I had something Gerald didn't know about, and I was going to use every penny of it. The first thing I did was call Beverly. Not to panic, not to cry. I was past the crying. I called her because she's sharp, she's steady, and she has her father's strategic mind, without his cowardice. Beverly is 40 now, works in healthcare administration, and she thinks 3 moves ahead in any situation. When I told her about the letter, there was silence on the line. Then she said, "Mom, don't touch anything, don't say anything, and call an attorney today." I did exactly that. The attorney I found was a woman named Patricia Osei, a family law specialist in Columbus with 22 years of experience and a reputation for being, in the words of one online review, the last person you want sitting across the table from your spouse. I liked her immediately. She wore reading glasses and a beaded chain, spoke slowly and precisely, and did not waste words. I laid everything out for her: the letter, the account I'd found, the behavioral changes, the inheritance I had not disclosed to Gerald. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set her pen down and looked at me. "You did the right thing, keeping that inheritance separate," she said. "In Ohio, inheritance is considered separate property, not marital. As long as you haven't commingled those funds with marital assets, he has no claim to them. But we need to document everything: his assets, his behavior, the timeline. And before we file anything, I want you to know exactly what you're dealing with." She recommended a private investigator. I agreed without hesitation. His name was Al Grover, a retired Columbus PD detective, quiet man, mid-50s, looked like someone's accountant. He charged $90 an hour, and he was worth every cent. Over the course of 4 weeks, he documented what I had already suspected, and some things I hadn't. Gerald had been seeing Vivienne Marsh for nearly 3 years. She was 51, divorced, worked in commercial real estate, which was, I assumed, how she'd helped him find the Savannah property. The condominium was being purchased jointly. Gerald had been quietly moving money for over a year, not huge amounts at once, nothing that would trigger obvious flags, but consistently, steadily, into a joint account he shared with Vivienne. Al estimated the total somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000. There was more. Gerald had also at some point told Vivienne that he and I were essentially separated, that we had been living as roommates for years, that I knew about the situation and had agreed to a quiet divorce once the time was right. He had told her I was fine with it. I read that in Al's report, and I had to put the folder down and walk outside and stand in my backyard for a while. The birds were making noise. The neighbor's dog was barking at something. The world was perfectly ordinary, and inside me something very cold had settled in. He had not just betrayed me, he had narrated a version of me to another woman, a version where I was resigned, passive, already defeated, without ever saying a word to my face. That was the moment I stopped feeling anything for Gerald except the very specific satisfaction of knowing what was coming. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a vengeful person by nature. I'm a 63-year-old woman who taught Sunday school for 12 years, who brings casseroles to sick neighbors, who cried at the end of every one of my grandchildren's school plays. I am not someone who plots things. I was not raised to think in terms of strategy and leverage. But I had a very good attorney and a private investigator's report and $1,540,000, and I had 31 years of knowing exactly who Gerald Whitfield was, including the parts he didn't know I knew. So I adapted. I continued to say nothing at home. Gerald and I had dinner together 3 nights a week, same as always. I asked him about work. He told me about a bridge project in Dayton. I made pot roast on Sundays. I was so good at this that sometimes I frightened myself, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt easy. When you've been betrayed deeply enough, something in you just closes, becomes very calm and very efficient. In the meantime, I worked with Patricia to prepare everything. Ohio is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets are divided fairly, not necessarily equally, based on a range of factors. Fault doesn't directly affect property division, but it does affect things like spousal support. And Gerald, with his hidden account, his transferred funds, his condo in Savannah, had given us a great deal to work with. Patricia filed a discovery motion before Gerald even knew we were in court. He found out on a Thursday afternoon when he was served at his office. He called me within the hour. I was at Beverly's house when my phone rang, and I saw his name on the screen. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. "What is this?" His voice was strange, tight and slightly too high, the voice of a man trying to sound controlled when he isn't. "Patricia Osei, you hired an attorney. Gloria, what are you doing?" "I'm protecting myself, Gerald," I said, "same as you." Silence. "I think you should call your own attorney," I said. "We don't have much else to talk about right now." And I hung up. Beverly looked at me from across the kitchen table. She didn't say anything. She just reached over and squeezed my hand. I will not pretend the months that followed were easy. They were not. Gerald moved out within 2 weeks. He went to his brother's house in Westerville, which told me the Savannah condo wasn't quite ready yet. He hired an attorney, a man named Fowler, who had a reputation for aggressive tactics, and a corner office in Dublin. Fowler sent letters. Fowler made motions. Fowler argued that my inheritance should be considered a marital asset because, he claimed, I had used some of the account's interest to pay for a household appliance, a refrigerator we'd replaced the previous fall. Patricia dispatched that argument in about 45 minutes. Then Fowler pivoted. He argued that Gerald's financial transfers were simply conservative planning for retirement, not hidden assets. He presented bank statements with explanations, projections, documentation of Gerald's intent. He made Gerald sound like a cautious, thoughtful man preparing for the future. Patricia put Al Grover's report into evidence, every transfer, every date, every dollar. She also put into evidence Gerald's name alongside Vivian's on the Savannah property deed, and the joint account, and the emails, 17 months of emails between Gerald and Vivian, obtained legally through the discovery process, in which Gerald discussed, among other things, how to structure the property purchase so that his current situation wouldn't complicate things. His current situation, that was how he referred to our marriage, our 31 years, our life, his current situation. The judge was a woman. I noticed that. I don't know if it mattered, but I noticed it. Gerald sat across the courtroom from me, and he looked like a man who was slowly understanding the dimensions of his mistake. His hair was greyer than I remembered. He'd lost weight. Vivian was not in the courtroom. I had wondered if she would be, but she wasn't. Whatever story he'd told her, she apparently wasn't ready to sit through the consequences of it. The settlement took 3 more months to finalize, but the outcome was not in doubt. Gerald's hidden transfers were treated as dissipation of marital assets, meaning the court factored them back in as if they still existed, then offset Gerald's share accordingly. He did not get half. He got significantly less than half. He was ordered to pay spousal support for 7 years, given our marriage length and the disparity in our financial situations, a disparity made worse, the record noted, by his own conduct. He did not get the Savannah condo either. That transaction fell apart once his finances became part of the court record. Vivienne, it turned out, had been counting on Gerald's contribution to close. Without it, the deal collapsed. I heard about this later through Beverly, who heard it from a mutual acquaintance. I don't know what happened to Vivienne after that. I don't spend much time thinking about her. The morning the settlement was signed, I sat in Patricia's conference room and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph exactly. More like the specific, quiet relief of having carried something very heavy for a very long time and finally being allowed to set it down. Patricia poured 2 small glasses of sparkling water. She kept a bottle in her office for exactly this kind of moment, she said, and handed one to me. You were extraordinarily composed through this entire process, she said. I had 31 years of practice, I said. We clinked glasses. There is something I need to tell you about the months after the settlement, because I think it is the most important part of this story, and it is the part that is hardest to explain to people who haven't lived it. I was not immediately happy. I want to be honest about that. I was 63 years old, newly divorced, living alone in a house full of 31 years of accumulated life. There were mornings when I stood in the kitchen and the quiet felt enormous. There were evenings when I sat on the back porch and watched the light go out of the sky and felt something I can only describe as the grief of a future that got taken from you before you knew it was gone. But I also had $1,540,000, a daughter who called every day, 2 grandchildren who thought I hung the moon, and the very clear understanding that the life I was building now was mine. Entirely mine. Not a shared project, not a negotiation, not something I was managing around someone else's priorities. Mine. I sold the house in Columbus. I had always loved Asheville, North Carolina, the mountains, the art community, the feeling that people there were living deliberately. I found a beautiful craftsman cottage with a sunroom and a garden and a view of the Blue Ridge that made me cry the first time I saw it, but in a completely different way than I had cried in my kitchen that morning with Gerald's letter. I started painting again. I had stopped in my 40s, too busy, too tired, the usual reasons. I took classes at a local studio. I was terrible at first, which I found I didn't mind at all. My teacher, a warm woman in her 70s named Joyce, told me that the hardest part of coming back to something after a long time away is forgiving yourself for the gap. I thought about that for a long time. Beverly visited with the grandchildren last October. We hiked a trail in the national forest, and my grandson, who is 7, held my hand on the steep parts without being asked. I thought about Aunt Frances then, her quiet, disciplined life, her Goodwill clothes, her 2003 Civic, and I understood for the first time what she had really given me. Not just the money, the choice. I have gone back and forth about whether to share this story. I'm a private person. I was raised to keep family matters inside the family, but I kept reading things online. Women my age talking about finding out too late, about not having resources, about feeling like there was nothing they could do. And I thought, I want them to know it's possible. I want them to know that composed and quiet is not the same as defeated, that waiting for the right moment is not the same as doing nothing. I also want to say this. I do not hate Gerald. I made my peace with that a while ago. He is a man who made choices that were selfish and cruel, and he paid for those choices, and somewhere out there he is living with that. I hope he finds some peace. I genuinely do, but I hope he finds it somewhere very far from me. I'm 64 now. I have a garden I tend every morning, a sunroom I paint in every afternoon, and a life that fits me in a way my old life, for all its good years, never quite did. Aunt Frances, wherever you are, thank you. You gave me the floor to stand on when mine disappeared. I will not waste a single inch of it. There's a letter I keep in my desk drawer in Asheville. I don't read it anymore. I don't need to, but I haven't thrown it away either. It's the one from the Savannah law firm, the one Gerald folded so carefully and hid between the water bill and a Costco mailer. I keep it because it reminds me of who I was the morning I found it and who I decided to become in the 10 minutes after. People ask me sometimes, usually women around my age, women who've heard pieces of this story, they ask how I stayed so calm through all of it. And I understand why that seems like the most interesting part, but calm wasn't really what I was. I was deliberate. There's a difference. Calm is something that happens to you. Deliberate is a choice you make when you're terrified and heartbroken, and you make it anyway. What Gerald never understood, what I think genuinely surprised him, even at the end, was that I'd been paying attention the whole time, not just to his behaviour, but to everything around me, to Aunt Frances and how she lived, to the finances he thought I didn't understand, to the patterns in his explanations that were just slightly too smooth. He had decided, somewhere early in this, that I was the kind of woman who could be managed, and that assumption was the most expensive mistake he ever made. I think about what it actually takes to survive something like this, and it comes down to three things that nobody teaches you directly but that you either develop or you don't. The first is integrity, not the word on a motivational poster, but the actual daily practice of knowing what you stand for and refusing to let circumstances talk you out of it. I could have confronted Gerald the morning I found that letter. I could have screamed, thrown things, made it immediate and loud. A part of me wanted to. But I knew that wasn't who I wanted to be, and more practically, I knew it wasn't what would actually protect me and Beverly and the life I had left to live. The second thing is clear, thinking under pressure. Real clear thinking, not the kind where you tell yourself a comfortable story. When I sat with Patricia for the first time and she explained my options, I had to be honest about what I actually knew, what I didn't know, and what I was willing to do. That kind of honesty with yourself is hard. It requires you to set aside fear and pride simultaneously, which is not a small thing. The third is endurance, the specific kind that looks quiet from the outside. I made pot roast on Sundays. I asked Gerald about his bridge project in Dayton. I did this for months while building a case that would eventually walk into that courtroom and dismantle everything he thought he'd secured. Nobody saw the effort that took. That's usually how real endurance works. It doesn't announce itself. Gerald's choices had consequences because all choices do. He moved money. He built a hidden life. He told Vivienne I was already resigned to losing. And every one of those decisions left a trail that Patricia and Al followed straight back to him. I didn't manufacture his downfall. He built it himself, one careful deception at a time. What I contributed was simply refusing to be who he decided I was. That's the part I want other women to hold on to, not the inheritance, not the attorney, not any of the particular circumstances that happened to work in my favor. The part that mattered was the decision, made on a cold kitchen floor in a bathrobe, that I was not done. That 63 was not the end of anything except the part of my life I'd been living for someone who didn't deserve it. Frances knew something about that. She lived her whole life on her own terms, quietly, without requiring anyone's permission or approval. I used to think that was loneliness. Now I understand it was freedom. She passed it to me in the only form that couldn't be argued with in court. I try to pass it forward however I can.